Welcome to Culture of Compliance. Today I'm going to speak with Tamiko Eto. Today, Tamiko Eto is joining us, Principal Consultant, AI and Research Administration and Oversight at HRP Consulting. Tamiko Eto brings over 20 years of leadership experience in human subjects research protections at world-class institutions. She's a recognized thought leader in interpreting and shaping policies around AI-enabled research, bridging the gap between cutting-edge innovation and regulatory frameworks. Her work focuses on building institutional capacity for AI oversight through rigorous yet pragmatic frameworks, ensuring research can advance without compromising the fundamental protections that safeguard participants. Ms. Eto's practical approach led to the creation of the world's first endemic AI IRB protocol submission and review platforms, and the co-development of numerous CITI programs and primer AI training programs, making sophisticated AI concepts accessible to research administrators globally. She actively shapes the future of AI ethics and policy through key advisory and leadership roles, such as the AI Ethics Advisory Board for the Institute of Experiential AI, Senior Teaching and Research Fellow for the Center of AI and Digital Policy, and others. Guided by a forward-looking vision, she advances the frontiers of research ethics to address the challenges of emerging AI technologies, fostering innovation that is both responsible and grounded in integrity. Welcome, Tamiko.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here today. It's very exciting that you're launching this new product line available. To begin with, in simple terms, what is advanced technology and also what is artificial intelligence?
Oh gosh. So I'm not going to provide an official definition of AI because there really isn't one. There's a lot of different versions out there, but at its core, AI is really just this set of like computational tools designed to perform tasks that would otherwise require human cognition. So things like recognizing patterns or making decisions or interpreting language or generating content. So even defining it this way, while it's informative, it gives us an idea, right? It's still kind of confusing for regulatory folks, which is my field, because it's hard to understand what box to put it in. So rather than define it, I just like to say, think of AI as a product, right? It's a man-made thing designed to be used for humans to do what would otherwise require another human to do. And humans are ultimately responsible for programming that thing to do it. So humans have to be accountable for that product that they put out there. More importantly, there has to be some legal pathway for a victim, worst case scenario, to take if they were harmed by this human developed tool. And unfortunately, that would require a governance framework that we currently don't have, most likely won't have in the near future. But that in a nutshell is AI.
In terms of what you discussed, what kinds of AI is out there now or advanced technology that research administrators should be aware of in a practical sense? Things like generative AI, large language models, which are very popular now, or other cutting edge tools that they should be aware of just in practical sense?
There's several categories, I'd say. And in my field, again, like every IRB administrator needs to become familiar with them, or at least just have a general working knowledge of. And you kind of pointed them out already. So like the first one I would say is generative AI and large language models. So systems like the ones that power ChatGPT or Gemini AI or Claude. Those are the ones that can summarize documents, write pretty much anything from poetry to even complex code. And they can even answer questions in natural language, which is why a lot of people tend to anthropomorphize them and form relationships with them because it's so human-like, and they tend to forget that these things are not human. And then there's other things like computer vision, predictive analytics, a lot of things, clinical decision support, and digital health technologies like smartphone-based data collection, passive sensing like you can get on your phone, and ambient listening. I can kind of describe what we would see in computer vision. So that one is going to kind of look at images on pathology slides or look at radiology scans when you go get like an MRI or something, and even like dermatology photos if you want to see if that thing on your arm is cancerous or not. And sometimes that computer vision can even identify your emotions, how you're feeling right now. So those are some really interesting capabilities. And then the predictive analytics and clinical decision support, I think, are some of the most prominent ones in the research field right now. So those are embedded actually in pretty consequential systems like predictive policing, criminal sentencing, probation, fraud detection, and what I see most, medical record systems. And unfortunately, a lot of these things are in there without patients or people that are being impacted by these tools knowing about them.
You've been so thorough with that description. I was wondering that that we have a foundation, I'd really love to hear about more about how AI and these advanced technologies can actually be applied to make an IRB administrator's life easier. And particularly, you said that people humanize these AI and machine learning and other types of advanced technologies. I'm sure we'll discuss the sort of the pitfalls and the benefits of humanizing these tools. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
On how it can make people's lives easier.
Do you think it's possible within an IRB setting, an IRB administrator, or even if you have hypothetical settings, if you can't share something exactly if it's under confidentiality?
Let's see. So, for example, there's a lot of companies and startup. I'm going to talk about IRB because that's my background. But a lot of companies and startups I'm seeing are starting to leverage like NLPs, which is natural language processing, and large language models, the LLMs, to help triage protocol submissions. So IRB protocol submissions. As you had mentioned in the intro, I developed one. And I've seen a lot of other companies try and develop their own as well. So lots of different versions out there. The thing is, a well-configured system, right, is going to work well. And one that is developed by somebody who's not in the field is not going to perform as well. So what we want it to do is we want it to be able to pre-screen protocols for completeness, flag missing elements, identify potential regulatory triggers. For example, like, does this require FDA or not? And then route submissions to the appropriate review pathway. Let's say, is this expedited, full board, exempt, et cetera, right? And that way it can get to a human reviewer and then they could actually confirm those findings and then go on with their actual review. And so in that agentic AI tool that I co-developed last year, we actually estimated through our testing about 30 to 40% reductions in administrative processing times. So that's a huge win for us, right? And even better, it was presented in this language that the researchers could understand. So no regulatory jargon. Like that's what everybody, the researchers were saying. Like, even if you create this, if I don't know how to answer it, it's not going to be helpful. So using that LLM, the NLPs, to really help simplify what we're trying to get from the researchers so that we can get it the first time. AI has that power. And so that streamlined the entire workflow and it improved our turnaround times. And again, like, we're not trying to replace IRB judgment. We're just trying to organize information in a way that prompts IRBs to evaluate it more systematically and then apply their judgment more meaningfully. And that enables them to do it more quickly, right? So I'd say that's one way that we could do that to make our lives easier. But again, it has to be done with those professionals in the field directing how we develop those systems.
I agree. And also, it can probably flag special review things such as vulnerable populations, pediatric trials, where you need an expert in the area, or trials that are investigator initiated are sometimes ranked in a higher risk category, or women who are expecting. It would have flagged those populations as well and driven them into the correct category of review. That's really wonderful. When I was consulting for a university, they were paper files. We pulled them from the shelf and people were assigned according to sort of what was on the shelf. But they had to review those files first. So it would take time.
Yeah, thank God we're not in that era anymore. Well, maybe some are, but hopefully out of the paper era.
No, it's surprising how many people are still using paper, but what are some other hypothetical examples? You said ambient AI can be used, I assume, for meeting minutes, but for other things as well, possibly?
Yeah. So kind of touching on that earlier response, like, let me preface this by saying it's important to note that what AI can do and what it should do are two very different things, like capturing attendance, discussion, things like that. Super helpful, but right. Technically, AI can do this, but that doesn't mean that it should. So, for example, meeting minutes for convened IR meetings, those are high stakes documents. They need to capture all that stuff that you mentioned, like attendance quorum, and what we call like substantive discussion for each protocol and the vote, and more importantly, like the rationale for that board's determination. And so, getting those nuances right is going to be critical. And so any errors or omissions that we know AI tends to have, they're going to create compliance vulnerabilities as well as could potentially cost someone their job. I have seen that. And AI, specifically like meeting transcription combined with like summarization, they can do a lot of like the structural lifting, but at the same time, it can pose a lot of risk if it doesn't get it right. So the value add here, the ROI, the return on investment, I think that's going to be questionable because a human reviewer, which is usually like an IRB coordinator or an IRB administrator, they're going to actually have to go back and review and edit everything, right? So that's double the time already. So in a sense, it saves time by you get a draft that you can start from, and it's always nice to have a draft to start from, but for liability and legal reasons currently, right? You're going to have to go back and make sure that the AI didn't leave anything out or hallucinate or create anything that didn't actually happen or quote anything that wasn't actually said. And so we'll need to establish some kind of healthy relationship with it so that we're not forgoing those important steps in that review process.
And that's a great example of where a consultant can fit in terms of operationalizing the AI and identifying the risks associated with compliance risks, really. You did mention at the beginning of the show, we talked about how people can humanize AI, advanced technologies, and one of the biggest pitfalls might be to, for example, upload protocols into a public AI chat, such as ChatGPT, one that is not authorized by the institution. That's information that should be kept private. It's proprietary, right? And then also, really, any information shouldn't really go into an open chat box. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. That's a really important point. A lot of the times when we hear, for example, an institution says, okay, employees, we have a contract with OpenAI. So now you can use OpenAI for some of your work. The difference between that contract and the contracted license version that you get under your employee is totally different from the public version that you can log on to with your personal email and things like that. And so if you end up using the wrong version, you're now putting confidential business information out into the public. And that one, I think the most important one is that could cost you your job immediately. And I've seen that happen to some people. But then also, obviously, right, we're worried about the patients and the PHI and the confidential business information that goes out there, any proprietary information, that stuff we didn't want leaked. And now it's feeding an AI that it shouldn't have. And I don't think we can actually get that back. So being aware of what licenses you have, what you're able to use it for. Like sometimes you'll get a license that says, yes, you can use it, but you cannot put in XYZ information. And so I would backtrack and say institutions have a responsibility to educate their employees to understand what the limitations are and how they can and cannot use the tools for certain reasons.
I was just going to say education sounds like it's going to be extremely important, and possibly the consultant's role to provide education that's really tailored to operationalizing the AI.
I have seen in my role, right, where we have these conversations and then we talk about something and then the client will say, I didn't think about that. And so, our role as consultants is to bring up these things that are not obvious, right? They are very not obvious, but they're very consequential. And so we're there to kind of make sure that we have all safeguards in place, not just for the research participants or the institution, but for the employee themselves.
I know that you work with larger institutions, but maybe for smaller community hospitals that are just getting their, maybe even clinical trials, social behavioral studies, and smaller institutions, maybe they haven't hired a consultant before. What would that look like exactly? Would they reach out to you online? or
Yeah,
does that?
so HRP has an intake section on their website where you can go in and input whatever services that you need. We have so many services available, but essentially, I would call it customized services for the client. So it's whatever you need, we can meet you where you're at. You don't have to be a large institution with massive resources. You can be a very small institution with very limited resources, and we'll just figure out where you're at and we can meet you there. That's really what's going to be most helpful is meeting the client where they're at and addressing the needs in that moment. And we could, pivot along the way, but what I love about it is that we have this relationship, right? We start the relationship early and then we just continue to grow and get to know each other and identify these needs. Sometimes along that way we can identify blind spots and then make some recommended changes, in the course of those conversations.
And it sounds like beyond protocol reviews that we discussed, as well as possible meeting minutes, there's also, it's really a whole compliance system. It's not just the IRB administration, but it's also the entire human subject protection program, as well as possibly other aspects of their program, such as animals or other aspects. Do you exclusively work with human subjects, or is it also expanded to include other aspects?
I specifically work under human subjects, but HRP is full of experts that know everything about everything. And we collectively share that knowledge and those resources. And so collectively we work together, hey, like there's this component that may need some expertise. And we'll bring in our collective wisdom to make sure the client gets what they need instead of having a gap. But in general, I think at a high level, my expertise comes in having that larger HRPP vision, right? So I can see how different ancillary committees across the university or institution, right, might need to come together and communicate about specific AI components that normally we wouldn't know who else in this institution is tied in or connected or a stakeholder that we need to bring into the conversation so that we can make sure that the client has the whole picture instead of walking away thinking they've done everything that they're supposed to do and then realize that there was a gap because we didn't fill that gap. And so, what our specialty brings in mind in this new service is that we have that larger picture in mind. I'm not going to tell you just what the IRB needs to know. I'm going to make sure that you know all of those other relevant touch points so that you're not left rushing like last minute to fill in those gaps.
No, that was a huge part of my practice as a consultant before I joined CITA program. I noticed that sometimes things were out of order as well with IRB review. So I'm sure you look at Radiation Safety Committee. When is the Medicare coverage analysis performed? You would look at all that, I think, right? And really must do a 360-degree review of everything. But it's also scalable. So if an institution is small, they don't need to pursue an extensive retooling of the program, but it could be discrete, right? They could purchase discrete advice but you still understand the big picture. I think that's important.
Yes. Yeah. And if they ever want to scale, that's also on the table.
Right. And what's so exciting about, especially even large institutions, I think would benefit very much from at least a review of where AI and advanced technology could be used in the sense that a lot of budgets are shrinking, even at large institutions. Grant money has changed in some ways. And although it doesn't remove the human aspect, it certainly can pick up some of the work, correct? For example, what about with informed consents? What about that area? Could AI and advanced technology be used in that area?
Yes and no. You see. So first of all, when it comes to the IRB, what I think you're saying is like drafting consent forms. And I would say that that is completely out of the IRB purview. If it's the researchers drafting the consent forms, I'd say that's already like a ship that has sailed. Like people are already using it actively. They are in it, they are doing it. Those are a majority of the protocols that we're seeing where researchers, they're smart, right? They are resourceful. They see these tools, they use them. That's what we're seeing. Researchers are using AI to draft consent forms, recruitment materials, things like that. It's generally good at bringing that out, but the IRB definitely would not be in that space. But that said, I would say that there's some pros and cons to using the AI in that area. And I'd say the most important one is from a legal perspective, the cons, right? So consent forms are typically drafted by the legal team to cover the institution primarily, and then but also making sure that we adhere to certain patient rights and things like that. And so when AI tries to simplify things, sometimes they change the language, which would put legal like repercussions on the wrong place. It could put it on the patient, right? Instead of the institution, or it could put it on the institution where it should be somewhere else, like the sponsor or things like that. So when we do use the AI to draft consent forms or any other material, including protocols, IRB protocols, right? We definitely want to be best friends with our legal team and make sure that they're reviewing anything that might have influenced like our standard template language. Did it change what we're trying to convey? And that could be complicated because sometimes the legal language, it just is what it is and we can't really change it, but it might be a true improvement. But that's something I definitely wouldn't want IRBs to make that judgment call on. So,
Right, and that's a great point. There's a lot of nuanced liability language for injuries as well. That's institutional often. And then there's also language related to the budget and related to finance. And you don't want the patient to be liable for things that they don't necessarily have to be.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's an excellent point that IRBs need to be aware of that it is being used, right? That it could affect, they really have to perhaps even more closely look at the informed consents. When I was performing Medicare coverage analyses, often there was a mismatch between all of the study documents. And maybe given that AI is used in different aspects, maybe it could be used, an internal one could be used to make sure that they match in some ways.
Yeah, I have to say I love that you brought that up because if there's anything that AI could potentially be good at and something that I find it most valuable for is in auditing. I think that like continuous quality improvement and auditing and those compliance issues, it's very good at identifying like incongruencies and inconsistencies in one document versus another or one department's. So for example, if a research team has to go through 5 different committees like radiation safety, biosafety, data privacy, or whoever they have to go through, right? And they all kind of get the same protocol, but at different time points. And so at those different time points, the stories kind of changed, or different questions were asked in different ways, so they got different responses, right? AI is going to pick up on those inconsistencies, and then if you wanted to use AI, you could actually bring them together so that you could have a harmonized document where everybody kind of sings out of the same songbook and gets the same protocol, right? That's something that an institution could invest in, but I would say that AI is probably really good at that right now. That would probably be, if I had a choice, that would be where I'd invest my money.
I'm exactly the same. I used to audit, and AI is fantastic at auditing because a human has to review it after, of course. But the scale and the speed of looking at data, finding inconsistencies is incredible. I agree. I think this is really the place as well to invest in. And in terms of the documents, I've also seen where the schedule of events might even differ slightly from the protocol even from the investigator's brochure to the clinical trial agreement to the consent form. So that would be a great place to make sure everything is at least in writing, right?
It would. Yeah. I mean, I think that ultimately is going to save the compliance issues downstream. So it could save the institution, but I think that because it saves the institution and the compliance issues downstream, then by default it's going to actually be a strong method for protection of human subjects or animal subjects or whoever it is that you're using that AI for.
That's a great point. We've talked about assignment, consent, reviews, protocol. I'll save the last questions for last. Is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't discussed? I agree that the most transformative, at least right now, at this moment, before the large language models become more able, is the ability to look at so much data so quickly and maybe not provide the result for you, but find the things that you're looking for. So you can find all the trials that have vulnerable populations and maybe audit those more easily, it feels like.
Yeah, I would say that. There's not much more to say about that.
Right. What about, could it be used to track compliance and continuing non-compliance and side effects and things like that? Or even if we're centralized IRBs, could it be easier to track things like that?
I think it could. I think that's important thing to track. The one thing that I would caution against is that when we do track those things, that two things. One, right, that's a very sensitive collection of data. And if that goes public, all right, that could be very detrimental to the institution. And so at this point, when you're collecting that level of sensitive information, you want the same level of cybersecurity risks and all those security information security risks that you would put on your very confidential business information, right? So the same scrutiny that you would put on institutional confidential business information, you want to put on your research administration systems, because that kind of information, if it got into the wrong hands, it could be devastating for the institution, for the researchers, for the staff, for everybody. And then I think the other one is, and this is, yeah, I've seen firsthand, is that depending on how that tool is built and who manages like the prompts and the code, executive leadership, they can actually exercise influence to the engineers and say, hey, change this code so that we don't collect certain information, or we don't flag it, or we underestimate the harms of certain things so that we don't have to report them. And so that kind of manipulation and negative influence on consequential issues, right, that should otherwise be reported is significant. And so there has to be some kind of governance within that institution to prevent executive leadership from manipulating the code that would be required for us to collect accurate reporting of those issues that come up.
That's an excellent point. I have two follow-up questions. I'm very concerned also with the training of people who are actually creating the software and the tools that we're using. I feel that they should be trained in compliance aspects and they should understand the basic compliance thoughts, including and also really the basics of human subject protections.
Yeah.
So that's an excellent point, but they can also affect to whom it's reported, correct? Not just they can report to a certain level only and then not to go up to the board or to the compliance committee, correct? I mean, couldn't that be also affected?
That could be affected. And I think you bring up a good point. In my experience, oftentimes the people who are leading like cybersecurity, information security, or like third party risk management, like identifying the risks of a specific software or device or tool, right? They are not experts in HIPAA. And so they don't understand truly, well, what is PHI and what are de-identification methods. And so that critical information is lost in translation. And so if they were asked, well, was PHI impacted? They might think, no, names weren't involved, so it's fine, right? And we all know that's not how you define PHI. But there's that gap in education. Now, training itself, I don't think is the solution. I think there should be levels of protection, meaning somebody would confirm those findings before it's a complete sign off.
That's a great point. But this would include a lot of people use this to build in-house things, but also dealing with third-party contractors as well, correct? But
Right.
would verify the third-party contractors. You don't have that much control over the coding or the way things were put together, but could a consultant come in and run case studies and test it that way, the software, before it's implemented system-wide?
Yes, and we have. So there are a lot of well-intended vendors out there who want to dip into the world and are developing some really awesome things. But when you kind of, trust but verify, and then you check their documentation, you see that there's a lot of missing things and a lot of, similar to like the PHI and the third-party risk management, right? Like gaps in understanding of what certain terms mean and legal definitions mean. And so consultants can come in and look at the third party vendor and evaluate where they're at, and if it's even safe to engage in that contract. I've seen people where they wanted to sign up with this person, but we evaluated their website, their claims, things like that, and we realized that there was actually some negative press and some complications with like their regulatory compliance under FDA and things like that. So having that kind of like, hey, heads up, you might want to think about looking at things like, these things, or evaluating this before you sign that contract, or at least at minimum, like put terms into your contract before you sign them, so that like worst case scenario, if anything were to happen, that liability would fall on them. And I think that's ultimately what institutions want to do when you're dealing with third-party vendors, is that you're taking on this risk. You're giving away this data, you're supporting their, commercial activities. So they should take on that risk. And so we want to make sure that we capture those things and guide our clients in making sure that they account for those things so that they can include those in the contracts, especially when it comes to AI.
I can't emphasize enough how important it is for a consultant or an expert in a subject matter expert to check the software before it's implemented system-wide. I've been involved in a case where I noticed that the software was actually creating compliance risk. It was creating non-compliance through just the way that it was running. And also, you want to do some due diligence and check if they have any outstanding motions before the federal government, if they have other things that are pending or previous settlements. It's a good indicator of, just to protect the institution. And it's a good indicator of their compliance overall.
Right. Related but somewhat non-related, I would also bring up, you mentioned, it kind of triggered in my mind, when we're dealing with that kind of, usually it falls under a research collaboration, right? Then now we're thinking about conflicts of interest, right? And how might we mitigate those conflicts of interest by managing how they analyze the data or market the data and evaluate the outcomes, or even like prematurely make claims about the tool before we've actually had the ability to verify that that is what it can do, and then engaging in a relationship which then could negatively impact our reputation. So those are all things that we also want to think about.
Absolutely. And that's a huge concern for institutions that also a consultant, I think, could help with. Another aspect is also, do you ever advise redundancy, in the sense that if it's an extremely large health system, I've seen systems where they don't go with just one contractor for very important things. They'll have two or three with the same function, but it's just in a sense that if one fails or if one has a cyber attack, something happens to their systems or their servers, then at least you have two others where you understand the process and they can take over, at least during that time period. Do you suggest things like that in terms of mitigating third-party risk?
I do recommend that. And that is kind of standard for what I've seen in larger well-resourced institutions. That is definitely kind of standard in how they would process these kinds of things. Though I do know that smaller, less resourced institutions probably aren't thinking at that level, or don't even have the resources to think at that level. And so what alternatives might you want to consider in those cases? Those are things that we can advise on.
And when those smaller institutions, keeping them in mind, we've talked about they could be used with human support in terms of narrating, not the final version, but a version of the meeting minutes, at least the basics. They've been able to process protocols into the right queue, align documents, but mainly most successful with auditing and monitoring day to day. So these you have probably also, can they detect the process so you can better create policies and procedures? Can they sort of detect and summarize the process, the operational system? Maybe they could summarize that in a way.
They can. Yeah, they can, because they're probabilistic models. So that's kind of what they do, is they look at that from that lens. However, that might not work for every institution, depending on what systems that they use, what platforms they use to process all of the different aspects that they do, whether that be like scheduling meetings or evaluating conflicts of interest, or reviewing an IRB protocol. And most institutions are dealing with multiple platforms and systems, and most of the time those systems don't talk to each other. And so it would be very difficult to train an AI to really deeply understand and accurately advise on something like that if it can't actually see the whole picture. Otherwise, you're having it evaluate something probabilistically on a quarter of the picture, if that, right? And then you're just going to waste all that money looking at the results and saying, no, that's not going to work.
I hope you are enjoying this episode of Culture of Compliance. If you are interested in more conversations about technology ethics, join me, Daniel Smith, for CITI Program's original podcast on tech ethics. You can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, back to your episode.
We talked about almost all the elements of an effective compliance program, except for perhaps assuming that they have their own compliance or the consultant is acting as a compliance officer or working in conjunction with the compliance department. Another one is just risk management. We've touched on it a little bit in terms of identifying vulnerable populations, and apologies to individual PIs that are by themselves, investigator-initiated protocols, but they do have a tendency to be higher risk just because the lack of support. There's not an institutional support behind them in the sense of a large pharmacy company. But those are some examples that at least I would, if I were making a risk matrix, I would say those were quite at the top. And also previous government findings, make sure that those are 100% audited and that they're 100% correct. But do you see that also as a future of AI, maybe with risk management, where you can, even large institutions don't have the resources to 100% audit everything?
Yeah, I'd say risk management is probably one of the AI strengths, assuming that there is somebody looking at the results, right? I mean, you could get one of two different outputs. One, it's capturing everything, and that's way too much. It's overreach, and you're like, that's way too much. We don't need to go that far. And so then it's like recommending or, suggesting that you've got to do all these things in order to meet your end goals. And that could be overly burdensome and panic mode steps in, right? Like, screw this, I don't even want to do research anymore. And then the other one is it might under evaluate what the risks are. And so you definitely want to have, someone looking at it and making this sound judgment of like, that one's a great idea. I didn't think about this. This one, I don't think that one's relevant for my case, or that one, depending on the institution's risk tolerance, yeah, we don't really look at that, right? So this we call human in the loop, or just this, end user is the human who actually has to verify and confirm everything. That's going to be important for that risk management. But I do agree that it brings tremendous value in that space if you're willing to look at what it has to say. And frankly, I think that if we were to use it in that space, surprisingly, I think you could save the researchers a lot of time, especially sponsor like the investigator-initiated trials, because who else are you going to rely on, right? Your research assistant, if they're seasoned, maybe, but if not, and you're kind of on your own, this kind of gives you a leg up. It says, hey, think of these things, put these things in place. Most of them are easy. Most of them are easy guardrails that you just put in your protocol, make sure you follow them, and that'll probably get your protocol approved faster, right? Assuming they're reasonable and not overkill.
Just to summarize, the highest risk probably in enforcement would be the FDA trials and the trials that are billing for services, probably to Medicare. I think as a summary, the False Claims Act and then your FDA. Just as a summary, probably is what I perceive. But would you agree those are the higher risk areas?
Yes, I do see that they're leaning more towards using AI to identify fraud in claims and things like that. And I would say that that is a place that needs to be tested a little bit more, or alternatively, right, you kind of piggyback it or like kind of duplicate that work through having a human actually verify all those things. Otherwise, it could potentially harm the people who are trying to really do good business out there. But in terms of actually identifying, some of the other issues that we talked about, which is those inconsistencies in documents and things like that, then it's a great place for AI to be.
And just what is the practical piece of advice you'd give to an IRB administrator, so rather small, who wants to start exploring artificial intelligence and advanced technology tools responsibly, but also for smaller institutions as well as for larger institutions, mid-sized too?
Okay, so I'm going to date myself here a little bit, but when apps were a thing a long time ago, everyone and their cousin was trying to build an app and sell their app. And at that time, I couldn't help but think not everything requires an app, but that didn't stop them from trying. And I think today, right now, not everything requires AI. So anybody who's looking into this space, I would say just start with the problem that you actually have, right? Not a technology that you heard about. So don't begin by asking, ooh, how can we use AI to solve this problem? But begin by asking, like, where are we spending a disproportionate amount of time on work that doesn't actually require expert judgment, right? That work does not require expert judgment. Then the AI could significantly add value without introducing what we would call unacceptable risk. So in my space, right, the IRB offices, maybe I would say intake, completeness is the protocol, complete, right? And then, as you mentioned, kind of like maybe looking at assignment workflow, like what reviewer might be good for this, and thinking about, conflicts of interest and things like that. And then, right, before we jump all in and start paying for things, then we might want to ask, right, like, let's assess the risks, right? Because the risks might outweigh the benefits and ruin our ROIs on things. So who has access to the data and what happens if it makes an error? Who is accountable? Who's going to take the responsibility and pay the money when things go wrong? Is the vendor, right, going to sign the right contracts and agree to the right terms? And then also training, right? Training the staff to then know how to use that tool and not just blindly like sign off on it. It's called automation bias. We call it also automation complacency, where we just like, yeah, that's about right. And you just approved it. So we want to train our staff to also responsibly adopt the tool. And that also takes a significant amount of time and investment. And so we have to think about all those things before we jump right in and try to put AI in everything that we do. So I'd say that's my biggest piece of advice.
That's consistent. This show does talk about sort of current events, and there was a recent article discussing that, how, in hindsight, after this, I guess, year of AI adoption, what healthcare systems, they're reflecting on their success. And many said that they wish that they had just done exactly the process that you stated, where just analyze, do we really need this, and not just another tool that might complicate things or might introduce risks that are unexpected from third-party vendors, where you don't know exactly where the data is going also is an issue. You might not even know when there's a data breach. There's a lot of concern with third-party vendors that should be, or if the tool is appropriate or in compliance.
I just say we've seen it all. We've seen it all. So because we've been blessed to see it all, we can kind of help you navigate that space a little bit more proactively. Yeah.
Yeah. The amount of expertise is incredible, and the breadth of experience, and everyone has sort of their own niche and specialty at HRP Consulting. So it's really impressive, the services that are provided. And a great thing also, you can ask your colleagues too, if you do have a question about an area that might be their niche.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just ask you as last question, just as we wrap up, just looking ahead 3 to 5 years, where do you see this headed for IRB administrators and also for the human subject protection programs?
3 to 5 years. So 2031-ish, right? Well, first of all, like AI is not even going to be what we know of it to be today. So that's going to be the next thing, right? It's probably not even going to be what we see AI today next year, right? It's just that's how quickly that is changing. But that means that it's going to add this complexity to like these risks and challenges that this field has to navigate. But, I do see that it's also going to result in significant benefits, right? Because AI brings like efficiency in administrative processing if we do it right. It brings more consistency in how we apply regulations. It's going to reduce this cognitive burden on a lot of researchers and IRB and research administration staff. And I think importantly, it's going to improve this equity in research oversight by making these reviews more scalable across institutions, whether you be big or small and well-resourced or under-resourced. So I think that it does have that potential. But at the same time, right, I don't know what's going to happen in that amount of time, but I can't imagine that the risks are going to be real. And the biggest risk in my mind we talked about, right, was that automation bias or that automation complacency. And so any tool operating this environment needs to be seriously evaluated. We talked about before, like be best friends with your legal team and your security experts. So looking, I guess, out 3 to 5 years, I think that we're going to see AI in probably most HRPPs and IRB management platforms, probably going to be standard feature in all of those tools that we see. I won't name them all. And unfortunately, what I also see is that most IRBs are going to continue to struggle to navigate all of this governance ambiguity that comes along with it. And probably because we don't have regulation, we'll probably also see a ton of litigation at the institutional level, the patient level, and all of that. So what I hope to see, I'm not sure if it will happen, but I do hope to see meaningful regulation before then.
You're saying that the United States in particular doesn't have a lot of regulation as compared to other countries. So it's a two-part question. In terms of litigation, do you mean injury to the patients or to the subjects? Or more privacy concerns, security concerns?
All of it. I think it could come in all directions because it impacts all directions. It's going to impact the institution's ability to maintain this very sensitive, confidential business information and processes and procedures and protocols that are worth millions of dollars, as well as the patients that are being impacted by AI that has not been validated and properly developed and is now being used to decide, significant aspects of their lives. And so that could also be an issue.
I'm also concerned about just general coercion concerns about, as we know, the consent is a continuous process throughout a trial's life, and the patient might feel more coercion if it is heavily advanced technology is interacting with them in some way, or they don't have someone they can talk to,
Yeah.
like a clinical research associate just to talk, or a nurse just to talk it through.
Yeah, I have seen that kind of like this tendency to kind of edge more towards like avoiding the human in that informed consent process, which I think violates the whole definition of informed consent process, that meaningful dialogue that you have with humans to answer your questions and express your concerns. And it's a very emotional moment in time for some people who are deciding high risk clinical trials, drugs that could be very consequential in their lives, in their families' lives. And so, replacing that human moment with AI could be problematic. But again, I think that that's going to require some level of AHRP, right? AHRP accreditation, AHRP itself as an institution could take this moment and really define what it means to have ethical and compliant research in the age of AI. What does it mean? How would you maybe pass an AHRP accreditation cycle knowing that a lot of these processes are being delegated to AI systems? And I think that's this gray space right now, right? We don't know. And so that would be a really important place for institutions to identify what constitutes safe and responsible research when AI is being introduced into that entire research process, where it be analyzing the data or consenting participants and all that kinds of things.
That's a great point. It's also important to consider the mission and the code of conduct of the institution as well. So I don't see how AI could actually make the decision, obviously, to make the decision about whether research should go forward or not, because we'll be increasingly unclear about how it was created and what its values are.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to introduce something that would be sort of negative, into the research determinations. That's a great point that AHRP could get involved in that. I used to do that big accreditation process. I'm very familiar with them.
Yeah, it's a really excellent space to be in. It's a great opportunity for research compliance and research oversight, because this is a time for us to stand up and define, right, a lot of the things that we're not going to get at the federal level. I think it's very exciting.
That's actually a wonderful point. There is a space, but it might not be AHRP. It could be somebody else. Wonderful point that you made. There just needs to be guidance from subject matter experts, kind of like consultants as well. Just because they have the subject matter expertise, I think it would be wonderful. And also, the great thing about consulting is that you see a wide breadth of institutions, and you're not just experienced in only one way to do things and with one set group of people. So it's a great way to experience in a very short time, really wide range of doing things and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's what I love about HRP is that you get to see so many different ways of doing things, these different ways of interpreting these very gray regulations and nuances and spaces, and then identifying what would be the best, right? Not just from like a regulatory and human subjects protections perspective, but also from like an operations perspective. What's actually realistic in this space? We got time and money and people and all that.
That's the biggest thing, just to operationalize the compliance aspects. Because if you do something that doesn't make sense operationally, then it just won't take hold. And also, it's okay to iterate quite a lot. That doesn't mean that something failed. This just means that you're getting closer and closer to the solution.
Yeah. Yes. That's part of being human, right?
Right. Right, exactly. And is there anything else you'd like to review or talk about before we close? We've discussed a wide range of things. I mean, even an exempt determination, could that be made by AI soon? Or, not AI, but just a
No, it cannot. Yeah, for sure. It cannot because there's so many nuances when it comes to the exempt determinations. I actually tried to build a tool to do that and it failed in testing and I just gave up because it's just too complicated. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend that space, especially these quality improvement, NHSR, and exempt determinations, just because the questions that you would have to go through is not, it's a very complicated branch logic, right? It's not even AI, it's more of like a branch logic, but you have to ask the questions in the right way. Because if you ask the question in a certain way and it gets misinterpreted in a different way, then you've just sent somebody in a direction that they probably will have to pay the consequences for later.
I recall, I think there was an entity that received a notice a while ago. It was doing just surveys to staff about XYZ, but it was considered research. So I remember that when I was working in QA/QI at a research university, I did go through the IRB process with my QA/QI activities, some of them.
Yeah.
That would be very hard to flag for AI or advanced technology, correct?
I would say so. It's because it's a very short conversation where you need a lot of information. And I think in that moment, in that conversation, the researcher is not prepared to give that level of detail that might trigger you going one way versus another. If you were to have like a full-on protocol, then maybe the AI would be more accurate in its determination. But usually in that early like thought stage of like, I wonder if this would require IRB or not, that's not the right time to make an exempt determination.
That's really fascinating, though, that we've summarized just in summary from this conversation that probably the greatest strength right now is auditing, monitoring, just because of the breadth of data and the speed that it can analyze. Especially it can identify high risk things that you're looking for, like a needle in a haystack type of things that you can then look at
For sure. Yeah.
as a consultant or as a compliance person, QA/QI person.
Yeah.
Then, so yes, it might change the meaning, I guess, of an ethics committee if it's only AI making the decisions.
Yeah. I've seen one institution that has actually moved to allow AI to conduct an entire review and make a recommendation. And the board would just look at that recommendation and then vote to approve it. And that's why I talk about the AHRP accreditation thing. I think this is a point in time where we need to really look at that and evaluate who's making the decision, who's having these conversations, who's based on their expertise and understanding of the regulations of the gray space that the AI is never going to pick up, right? Who's making the decisions? Who can we place the blame on, right? Litigation, and put that accountability on. And I don't think that we're ready for that in the space for this sensitive topic, which is research that impacts human lives. So yeah.
As you noted, though, there is not only a bias in humans toward automation, to believing that it's correct, but also, as we all know, I'm sure we've all read that the AI and advanced technology does have a bias to be optimistic, I guess, toward the user and toward its own results. So if it perhaps wrote a protocol and also contributed to other aspects of that, it might view it more positively.
Yeah, brilliant idea.
No, you're right, exactly. So it might have a sort of a double bias.
Yes.
So it has to be used very carefully in that area.
Yeah. That's an important point that you brought up, because one of the most critical pieces in research, whether it be AI research or not, is the scientific literature and the background behind that study, right? What science has led to this thing that you now want to do? What justifies this thing that you now want to do? And if you ask AI, like, hey, I want to study this or that, create me a protocol, one, they're going to pull from public data sets. So it's going to limit what it's able to pull from, like legitimate. There's some publicly available legitimate research out there. But, the bigger picture, I think it's going to miss. And it's also going to hallucinate things, right? And so I think that we really need to make sure that that sound research design and that scientific validity is the basis of all research that comes out there. And that's something that AI is not able to replicate in the current moment.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was extremely insightful. I'm looking forward to learning more about this area, and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Just wanted to give thanks to our line producer, Evelyn Fornell, design and line support provided by Raymond Longeray and Megan Stewart. Looking forward to bringing more conversations on culture of compliance.